All right, welcome everyone to this week's Working Through It Wednesday, hosted by the Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina, which is a grant-funded program of South Carolina's Department of Education's Office of Special Education Services. Our program is housed in USC's Department of Psychology Research Lab. I'm Taylor Davis, and we are pleased to bring you all this month a series focused on cultural responsiveness. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Erin Schurter, to provide a brief introduction of our esteemed guest, Dr. Michael A. Lindsey. Erin?
Thanks, Taylor. We are so thankful to have Dr. Michael Lindsey here with us today. He's a noted scholar in the fields of child and adolescent mental health, as well as a leader in the search for knowledge and solutions to generational poverty and inequality. He is the executive director of the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research at the New York University. At NYU McSilver Institute, Dr. Lindsey leads a team of researchers, clinicians, social workers, and other professionals who are committed to creating new knowledge about the root causes of poverty, developing evidence-based interventions to address its consequences, and rapidly translating their findings into action through policy and best practices. Dr. Lindsey leads the working group of experts supporting the Congressional Black Caucus Emergency Task Force on Black Youth Suicide and Mental Health, which created the report Ring the Alarm, The Crisis of Black Youth Suicide in America. Also, he's a member of an expert advisory board for the JED Foundation and a distinguished fellow of the National Academies of Practice and Social Work. Needless to say, he is very welcome and well esteemed and very prepared to be here. So we're so thankful to have you, Dr. Lindsey.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's great to be here.
Absolutely. So we're going to get started just asking a few questions, if you don't mind. And we'll run with it here, just having a dialogue, expressing some interest in your work, as well as your research and things that you found. So our first question for you, Dr. Lindsey, what are the prevalent guiding principles that we need to be aware of as educators to ensure we are being culturally responsive? That's a very broad question. We wanted to open up the floor to you.
Well, for me, it's as simple as a concept that I have thought about over the years that I framed as authentic engagement. You know, if you start from a place of authenticity, you can go a long way in terms of cross-cultural practice. And what I mean by that is when you're working with a person of color, for example, and you don't know much about that that person's community, background, etc. You know, it's not that person's responsibility to teach you about their lives or the history of their circumstances as people of color. It's incumbent upon you to do due diligence to understand what that person brings to the clinical context by way of the historical experiences of that particular racial ethnic group. And then I think it starts with a place of having some genuine compassion and concern about that person's unique circumstances or experiences. It's not so much that we're trying to impart our perspectives or what we think that person should be focused on in their lives. It's really about being where they are and understanding, you know, where they're coming from a place of compassion, you know, a listening ear, a welcoming regard for their experiences, and then bringing to bear your clinical repertoire skills to address the situation. But to put the onus on that particular person to provide all of that context of the historical experiences, et cetera, without you having done the work yourself is, you know, it's in some ways maybe a bit of malpractice, to be quite honest. And I hate to say it in that sort of stark and drastic of, a way of, expressing this, but I just think that it is a form of malpractice. And so then in order for you to have that regard, it takes some inward digging of your own biases and prejudices or things that, you have grown accustomed to thinking as it relates to that, person of color. And it really might be painful and hurt in some ways, because we all have, things that we're working on. No one is perfect. And so there might be some ugly things that need to be addressed. And so it takes that level of commitment, to the work in order to be a person that's in position to make a difference, and to be, sort of culturally responsive. But to sum it up, it's incredibly important to be authentically engaged, and focused on those things that I've just laid out.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Lindsey. Meeting your clients where they're at, I really appreciate the notion of being firm in stating, this could be a form of malpractice if you're not meeting them where they are, if you're not doing the work on your own end. Certainly, I can see how we would categorize it in that way. So we wanted to follow that up by just checking in and asking, how does your research in poverty relate specifically to the current culture or climate we are facing in our society as it relates to education?
Well, one of the things that I've thought about in this space of work that I do as the executive director of the McSilver Institute is that I think about poverty, its root causes and consequences. And what I've come to realize is that there's a trauma associated with poverty. And I call it the trauma of poverty. And what I mean by that is there's somewhat of a visceral reaction that, families, children that I've worked with, or that we work with in a broader sense in terms of the work of the McSilver Institute, that are really struggling with matters of food insecurity, housing instability. Think about how traumatizing it is when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, or that when you lay down tonight, you're not certain whether you have a stable and comfortable place in which to lay your head. Think about the emotional toll that takes on you. And these are, situations that kids and families are experiencing on a daily basis. What I like about the sort of contemporary context that we're in is that we're no longer thinking about racism or discrimination as, sort of distinct constructs in and of itself. Racism, discrimination. This, climate that we're in is really forcing us to think about the sort of insidious nature of racism and discrimination from structural and institutional perspectives. And so it's not enough then to think about individual acts of discrimination or racism, but in what ways do institutions perpetuate racism and discrimination by virtue of something as simple as, going back to a poverty context, the extent to which there is sufficient food stamps that are offered to families to sustain them over the entire month. A colleague of mine here at NYU, Lisa Janetian, did a study showing that behavioral problems had an uptick at the end of the month for Black and brown kids. And when she further investigated why that was the case, she found an association with these families, the families of these kids, that they were running out of food stamps. And so essentially these kids were coming to school hungry and dealing with all kinds of issues related to poverty that essentially led them to act out in some kind of way. Perhaps they were trying to get attention, bring attention to the issue. And so, that is a structural issue, that we can do something about. Much of public policy is related to perpetuating, if not corrected, these injustices, these sort of things that may be seemingly benign because you're trying to, not fund poverty-related policies or mandates so that you can allocate money elsewhere. Well, that has an effect on communities. I mean, are there viable employment opportunities for that family and that community for them to have a sustainable living? And so I think that the current discourse that is forcing us to look structurally and institutionally at how we are perpetuating racism, discrimination, and how it has a sort of cascading effect on things like, poverty, maybe even community violence, are things that are, for those of us who have been in that space of looking at these issues and have been saying for years and years and years that these are institutional matters that need policy level intervention, it's a welcome relief that we have now shifted this conversation, hopefully in a meaningful direction that's going to really address these issues at scale. Because, it's going to take that level of focus and intervention to have a sustainable impact.
Thank you for those words, Dr. Lindsey. I would completely agree that those of us that have worked in education have seen for a while the systemic and institutional issues that are related to the current culture and climate. I'm glad in some ways, like you said, that the conversation has shifted, and thankful for people such as yourself that can help us learn how to highlight these certain areas so that we can make change, so that we can impact lives. Because having compassion, like you said, being authentic and having that compassion for our students to understand what they're going through in relation to just coming to school can really help us to begin to make the mental change and begin the conversation. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our next thought comes around your research, and that highlighting the important elements of providing mental health to support Black youth as you've seen in your research. So meaning therefore educators or school mental health or mental health providers in general, what have you found through your research that's the most important elements when we're providing mental health for students, for Black youth, to support and prevent mental health issues?
Well, recently, I had a study that was published in the journal Pediatrics that looked at um, suicide behaviors among US youth from 1991 through 2017, 2017 being the latest year for which data were available. And this is data associated with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that is collected every other year since 1991 by the Centers for Disease Control. And over that span of time from 1991 through 2017, we looked at 4 indices of suicide-related behavior. So thinking about suicide, planning suicide, attempting suicide, and having an injury by suicide attempt. What I found, well, my colleagues and I found unexpectedly, I was not anticipating this, was that, well, just generally for the categories of thinking about suicide and planning suicide, over that span of time, there was a downward trend. So every youth, racial and ethnic group, and experienced a downward trend: white, Black, Latino, Asian American, etc. When we got to suicide attempts, Black youth were the only group for which we saw an increase, while every other racial and ethnic group saw a decrease over that span of time. And the increase was by 73%. And then for injury by attempt, we saw that Black adolescent boys were the only group that saw an increase in injury by attempt, suggesting that they were engaging in more lethal means by which to attempt suicide. And that increase for that group was 122%. Now, I've been asked over and over again, what do I think are the reasons as to why we see this increase? And to be quite candid, I don't have any definitive answers. We're engaged in research to try to really understand what might be leading to these trends. But what I can tell you is that I'm going to go to the schools, and what I know over the last 15 or 20 years or so that we've been able to document this is that Black and brown kids are suspended and expelled from schools. And many folks have said it's related to implicit biases that educators have with respect to how they view and interpret the behavioral presentations of Black and brown kids versus white kids. And the presumption is that white kids are offered supports to help them with their mood, emotional well-being, their academic well-being, etc. And there's a tendency to view those issues quite differently for Black and brown kids. And so I think that it represents, for me, an opportunity for school behavioral health professionals to really, really lead the charge in helping to convey in meaningful ways what and how those behaviors should be interpreted. We know as behavioral health professionals that we can treat those kids and provide the level of support that we've been trained to do, so that we can offer those supports to kids and keep them in school, engaged socially and academically. And so we have that charge, because what we know is that when kids are suspended and expelled from school, it starts a vicious cycle of those kids being involved in juvenile detention. And many have coined this phrase, the school to prison pipeline. To me, the school to prison pipeline is directly related to this issue, that we're not treating these kids for issues that are treatable, and we're suspending them or expelling them. And so I try to bring that level of attention and focus in my work with respect to how I interpret the findings. Like, I think then that, you see the suicide attempt rates going up for Black kids because they're not receiving the requisite services or access to those services that they need. Certainly there is stigma in the Black community related to mental health treatment, acknowledgement of mental health symptoms related to depression or trauma, etc. I get that, but I also believe that we can do something about these issues by just being there and giving those kids an opportunity to receive the supports we have to offer instead of those kids being suspended. And if we're not there, then those kids don't have access to that opportunity. And so from a policy perspective, I've been advocating for, in my own ways, the fact that we need more mental health professionals, behavioral health professionals in schools. Like, no school should be without a behavioral health professional. And there should be the appropriate number of professionals relative to the number of kids in that school. One behavioral health professional cannot meet the needs of 1,000 kids. And so I speak very passionately about this because I know that it will make a difference. I was speaking to a principal of a school last week who told me that he has 7 behavioral health professionals in his school, and there are about 2,000 kids. And he said that just having those 7 professionals in the schools has, in 1 year, taken his high school graduation rate in an urban setting from 67% to 89% in 1 year. 1 year, right? So we know when we do this work and we ensure that these professionals are available, that it makes a difference. And so, again, I think that what I'm finding in my research relative to these rising trends in suicide behavior among Black youth is directly related to that. When I've talked to city leaders here in New York City, who are, concerned about this, who are really trying to figure out how do we get more professionals in schools, and I find that meaningful because and important because they were able to indicate the need or document the need by mapping the city and showing the schools where there wasn't a mental health, behavioral health professional in that school. And it shouldn't shock us that there tended to not be a professional available in places where they were needed most. So those are the things I think about, and how I think my work reflects a particular opportunity, I think, and I'm calling it an opportunity because I think we should seize the moment for behavioral health professionals to be in schools. My dear friend, colleague, mentor, Mark Weiss, has talked and worked over the years. He's talked about an expanded school mental health model where you're offering, services at all levels of intervention in the school. And so we need, behavioral health professionals who are trained to deliver services at all of those levels that Mark has talked about, because it matters. It matters, and it will make a difference in terms of how we meet the needs of Black and Brown youth.
Discussing equity, reduction of stigma, accessibility, all of these pieces of the puzzle are incredibly important to reducing barriers to care for all youth, but especially persons of color. Meeting your students where they're at, making sure that you're not, that you're not putting your own kind of spin on their lived experience is of critical import in reducing suicide rates around the nation. And we're so grateful that you're able to share that messaging in such a strength-based way. And I think that both Aaron and myself, as well as our community, could probably rattle off 1,000 more questions for you today. And we could hold you here on the Zoom call for a lengthy amount of time. But we are really privileged to have had you today and are so grateful that we will have the opportunity to spend some time with you again, right? You're not going to run off on us. You're going to stay with us. Hear you away today.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's in a few weeks. I'll be speaking with you all. Yes. Looking forward to it.
We're so looking forward to having you, and we're hoping that everyone that watches today is going to register for your webinar that we're going to be hosting. The Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina is going to be hosting on July the 30th at 4 p.m. And Dr. Lindsey will be presenting on suffering and silence, signs of suicidal behavior in Black youth, so that we can extend this conversation and support ending the silence and reducing the stigma and creating more awareness around a topic that is very close to my heart, very close to the heart of many South Carolinians, most South Carolinians, I'd say. So we just wanted to give you a massive COVID high five, hug with permission, high five. So thank you so much for being with us today. We are just absolutely humbled by you taking the time with us today and sharing your expertise with our community. We cannot wait to have you bend our ears again on the 30th. And we look forward to seeing everyone who tuned in today, as well as new registrants. On the 30th, please log into www.schoolbehavioralhealth.org/webinars, and you can go ahead and register for Dr. Lindsey's webinar on the 30th, or you can follow us at the Southeastern School Behavioral Health Community on Facebook, and you can also register there or on Instagram as well as Twitter. So without keeping you for too much longer, mountains of gratitude, exceptional amounts of thank you and praise, and we look forward to seeing you.
Likewise, thank you for having me, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Awesome.
All right.